get a sense from the audience before I begin of like how many of you are from Sussex Friends of Palestine? If you could just raise your hand. Okay, great. So there's a number of you who maybe aren't involved with the student group. How many of you aren't from that group but are sort of involved in this issue in other ways? Okay. And how many of you are coming here to see maybe to learn some things about the situation that you might not already know? Okay, good. That's really helpful for me to know because I want to be able to offer you what is most helpful to you. So my name's Balzer. I'm so excited to be here. I'm just in the UK for a few days, and it worked out great to come down here, and I have heard great stuff about the local groups here, so it's an honor for me to hear about what people over here across the Atlantic are doing. I'm from the States, and I got into this issue when I was living in Turkey, and I traveled through the Middle East, met Palestinians for the first time, and heard from them a very different narrative than what I'd grown up hearing as a Jewish American. And I traveled to Palestine and saw things with my own eyes and became very active on this issue. So I want to start by giving you showing some parts of the occupation and Israel's policies that I learned along the way that I saw with my own eyes, and then also talk about some things that people here can do to get involved in this very exciting movement. So I want to start first by clarifying a few different terms that I'll be using during this presentation, and these terms can be confusing for some people, and that confusion can maybe prevent people from being able to move forward. So I wanted to distinguish between what it means to be Jewish. So someone who's Jewish is someone of the Jewish religion or the Jewish lineage. So my mom's Jewish, her mom's Jewish, etc. And that, to be Jewish, is different from what it means to be Israeli, which is a citizenship. If you're an Israeli, you're a citizen of the state of Israel. And being Israeli is different from what it means to be a Zionist. And Zionism is a political ideology. People have different definitions, but the way that I'll use it is support for a Jewish state in historic Palestine. Anyway, these are three separate categories. Sometimes they overlap in the same person, but they're not the same thing. There are Jews who aren't Israeli, like me. I'm an American. There are Israelis who aren't Jewish. About 20% of the people living with Israeli citizenship are Palestinian, and I'll talk about them. There are Jews who are anti-Zionist, who say this land should be for anybody who's been, whose families have been there for generations. It doesn't matter what their religion or their ethnicity is. And then there are Zionists who aren't Jewish. The increasingly influential Christian Zionist movement that talks about Armageddon really has nothing to do with protecting Judaism or Jews, but is about supporting Israel. So we see in the ways in which these things are different, and it's really, really important that we keep these things clear. First of all, to in no way associate the things that Israel is doing with Judaism. Occupation, discrimination, these things have nothing to do with Judaism. And likewise, to counter this sort of notion that to speak out against human rights, to oppose human rights violations is somehow to oppose Judaism. That's a really dangerous and frankly offensive association to make. And so it's important that we not be sort of silenced in terms of speaking out that it has nothing to do with Jews. So with that, I'll start the presentation. So if this works, otherwise I'll have to do it manually. There we go. So this entire area is historic Palestine. In 1948, the State of Israel was created. I'll talk about how that happened in a bit. In the blue areas here, leaving Palestinians, the indigenous population, mostly confined, those who remained, mostly confined here to the West Bank and then the Gaza Strip, which became known as the Palestinian territories that were then occupied by Israel in 1967, when it occupied all remaining Palestinian lands. And I'll talk about the occupation. I'll also talk about the situation inside 1948 Israel, and then also the refugees around the area. So I'll be starting, since I was living and working in the West Bank, I'll start by talking about the situation there. And one of the first surprises to me was the road system in the occupied West Bank. In the occupied West Bank, there are both Palestinians and Israelis living there, but they use separate roads. They're Palestinian roads, oftentimes unusable, like this one that has been blocked with an Israeli military roadblock. They're Israeli roads mostly built or taken by the Israeli government for its own citizens. The Israeli population living there are settlers who are exclusively Jewish, while the Palestinians living in the area are, for the most part, either Muslim or Christian. So what this amounts to in practice is one kind of road if you're Jewish and one kind of road if you're Muslim or you're Christian. There's also a system of segregated license plates. Israeli cars or Jewish settler cars in the West Bank have yellow plates, while Palestinian cars have green or white plates, and this makes it easy to see from far away which kind of person is using which kind of road. Here we see actually where some roads converge, and so you have a left lane for Israeli cars and a right lane for Palestinians, all of whom have to stop here on the right at what's called a checkpoint. And checkpoints are a really big part of the occupation, among many other institutions. Palestinians are forced to stop to take out their ID cards issued by Israel, answer questions, sometimes undergo searches of their belongings, even their persons. And it can be a very sort of humiliating and frankly just sort of disruptive and difficult part of daily life. A lot of people assume that checkpoints must be between Palestinian areas and Israeli areas, but actually most of them are located inside the Palestinian West Bank, between Palestinian towns and villages. So what this means is that very basic parts of life become difficult. So here, there's a Palestinian businesswoman. It's hard to hold down a steady job. You know, if you don't know if it's going to take you 10 minutes or 4 hours to get from your village to the city where you work, you may not be sure if you can get back home to your family. I mean, to travel a distance, let's say between here and London, it took me an hour and 10 minutes to come down here this afternoon. To go that distance for a Palestinian could take 4 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours. Maybe they wouldn't get there if things are particularly bad that day. And so it makes life very, very difficult. Even the most basic things like holding down a job. Students, you know, imagine if instead of getting up and coming to classes in 5, 10, 20 minutes, however long it takes you to get here, if you had to leave your house at 4 in the morning to make classes, how that would disrupt your studies. And then, of course, health is a really big issue. Here's a Palestinian ambulance, and they also have to pull over, often wait for long periods of time. There's many stories I could tell you, personal stories where I interviewed people, but I don't want to spend too much time before moving on to action. But a lot of, we have a lot of stories of Palestinian women who gave birth at checkpoints, unable to reach Palestinian hospitals to give birth there. People who've died who were in immediate need of health care. So health is a really particularly dangerous thing with these checkpoints. Of course, if the people traveling in the ambulance were of a different background, they would not have these problems. They have a very different kind of life. So here we can see what's called a settlement built in the occupied Palestinian West Bank. Settlements are the home to Israeli settlers. Again, this land is within the occupied Palestinian West Bank. It's internationally recognized Palestinian land, but you have this settlement exclusively for Jewish Israelis built on top of it. Now, have we seen this kind of a system before? Of a foreign country coming into an area, pushing off the indigenous population, and building towns and cities for its own civilian population? Sound familiar? Yeah, this is not something new or unique to Israel. It's something that's happened throughout history. It's something I think everyone in this room can be familiar with, and there's a word for it. It's called colonization. And Israel not only carries out this colonization, but actively promotes it. So, for example, here's a sign on an Israeli-only road in the West Bank. It's in Hebrew. It says "now more than ever," and then underneath it explains if you move to our community, and this is for Ariel settlement, you will be rewarded with 100,000 Israeli shekels, which is about between 15 and 20,000 pounds. Let's say 15. In other words, Israel is actually paying its own citizens to move on to more Palestinian land to become part of this illegal settlement population. Settlements are illegal under international law. And of course, as an American, I'm keenly aware that when the Israeli government is paying for something, of course, that's me as an American taxpayer paying for that. So I'm very much aware that I'm coming from, in many ways, the belly of the beast, supporting Israel's policies. But of course, the British government also has close relations with Israel. So it's something, that we're all connected to, regardless of our particular national backgrounds. So a lot of the settlement population is actually there for financial reasons, which we often don't hear about. And it's important because sometimes people sort of think that settlers are just these sort of wacky people and very difficult to control, without realizing that actually most settlers are going there because they're being paid to do so. And that really shows the way that the Israeli government is behind this colonization. But there are settlers who are there for ideological reasons, who feel this land belongs to the Jewish people, and non-Jews living there have no place there. And they can be quite violent, coming with US-made weapons, killing, maiming, pushing off Palestinians with virtually no consequences. This is a map of the settlements around the West Bank, thanks to our generosity as the United States. And you can get a sense of sort of just how much of the land in the West Bank is taken up by the settlements. So I talked a bit about the West Bank, and now I want to very briefly talk about Gaza. I have never been there, and so I don't have the kind of eyewitness experience there, but it would be wrong to not talk about Gaza. But really, it deserves its own presentation altogether because of just how bad things are there. So the occupation continues in Gaza. The settlers were taken out in August of 2005, but occupation is defined not by settler population, but by control. And Israel remains in complete control of the Gaza Strip, remaining in full control over the borders, the airspace, the shores, the land. Palestinian fishermen can't go fishing. In terms of borders, Palestinian people are unable to get in and out. Things have slightly changed with the Egyptian Rafah border being opened a bit more, but still extremely difficult. Palestinians denied adequate water, electricity, building supplies, medical supplies. There's malnutrition, massive unemployment. Palestinian exports are prohibited, so it's extremely difficult to even have an income, even when you have opportunities, let's say, to buy something. And imagine as students, there are many Palestinian students in Gaza who might, let's say, get a scholarship. A friend of mine actually in the United States got a full ride to a German university. I mean, tuition, grants for his living expenses, etc. Too bad. He couldn't go there. First of all, he had no idea if he'd ever get back into Gaza to see his family again. And he would need to get a permit by Israel to go, and he was quite sure that he wouldn't be able to get it. So the people of Gaza are living in many ways in a kind of open-air prison. There are, of course, many Israelis in the Israeli army, in the settlements, but also many Israelis who do not support what their government is doing, and as well as I come from a Jewish anti-Zionist population in the United States that is actually getting very, very big, which is exciting. So it's just important to point out that there's actually also a number of Israelis, including Israelis who are calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which I'll talk about later in the presentation. But here's actually a demonstration by Israelis and Palestinians against the wall that Israel's building. That is the last part of the occupation that I want to talk about. So this is a picture of me and a friend of mine in front of the wall that Israel's building in the West Bank. This is what it looks like in populated areas. It's about 8 meters, concrete, twice the size of the Berlin Wall. A lot of people sort of try to justify the wall, saying, well, these people have been fighting, and maybe if we just stick a wall between them, they'll stop, which is, some would call faulty logic on its own. But let's say that even was an acceptable reason to build a wall. You would think that the wall would be built between Palestinians and Israelis. But in actual fact, if you look at a map of where the wall is being built, this black and white line here, the vast majority of the wall actually goes deeply into the West Bank, in effect annexing huge swaths of Palestinian land, including up here where many of the major water sources are. And you'll find a lot of Palestinians today don't have access to adequate water, including especially in the Jordan Valley. And I know that people here in the area, people in Brighton, have a particularly close connection with the Jordan Valley. So I was really happy to hear that, and maybe someone from those groups can talk about that connection. So you have this kind of you see these kinds of images in Palestinian villages, and then you have settlements with these big, nice pools using water that is from the Palestinian land itself. So a lot of water sources taken, and then down here, of course, is Jerusalem, a holy city for all the people in the, all religious people in the area, including Jews, Muslims, and Christians. But today, for the vast majority of Palestinian Muslims and Christians cannot get to their holy sites, to their places of worship. So there's a problem of religious freedom in addition to everything else. And then, if you take into account not only the wall but also the checkpoints and settlements and home demolitions and outposts and a lot of things that I didn't even get to talk about, the areas that are off limits to Palestinians are more like these blue areas, which means Palestinians are being squeezed into smaller and smaller enclaves, oftentimes likened to Bantustans during apartheid in South Africa, to Native American reservations, etc. And in particular, let's take the example of Bethlehem here. So Bethlehem has been cut in half. And here's a picture of a friend of mine's home in Bethlehem with the wall right up against it. And this is the case for many Palestinian homes in Bethlehem. And if you look at what's on the other side of her house, is her trees, is her land. So here's the city of Bethlehem where the people live, and then here's the city of Bethlehem's land. And this picture is helpful to me because it shows the myth that the wall is about security. In what way does it make Israelis safer to build a wall between Palestinians and their olive trees and their olive groves? There's so many things that are presented as security related, when we really see the way that they are enacted on the ground, it doesn't really make sense within the context of security. You know, if you want to secure your country, you would want to define your borders and make them strong. Strong national borders is good for security. But Israel, in its entire history of being a country, has never officially defined its own borders. They continue to expand over time, annexing more and more Palestinian land. Does that make Israelis safer? If you want to secure your citizens, would you pay them tens of thousands of pounds to leave 1948 Israel and to move onto more Palestinian land in the West Bank, surrounded by Palestinians? Does that make them safer? As we begin to dissect these occupation policies, it becomes clear that it's very difficult to justify them within the context of security. So if it's not about security, what gives? What is it about? And I think the following 4 maps, which I'm sure many of you have seen, begins to make sense a bit of the occupation and the way that it fits into a much longer process of what's happened in historic Palestine. So these maps show the progression of land transfer in historic Palestine. The green areas here indicate Palestinian land, and the white areas here indicate land that was purchased and owned, well, purchased for the most part, by Zionists who had started to come into, or Jewish people who'd been there previously by 1940.